Treatable. Really, it's treatable. Yes, it's treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. Say what's on your mind. It's the Treatable Podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
We all know people who went through a challenging experience together and then emerged as lifelong friends. Maybe you yourself have been through something like this. In these situations, people often joke about being trauma bonded. But is that really a trauma bond? Well, a quick Google search might tell you otherwise. So what really is trauma bonding? How do our traumas sometimes unite us? And is it a healthy bond with people this way, or is it harmful? Welcome to the Treatable Podcast with me, your host, Clint Mally. Today, we're taking a critical look at trauma bonds, what they are, how they form, and what we can do about them if they're keeping us in a bad relationship. Our guest today is the amazing Karen Robinson, LCSW. Karen has received her BSW and MSW from the University of Maine. She's got 24 years of clinical experience under her belt as a social worker, therapist, and coach. In sessions with clients, Karen values authenticity and compassion, and her specialties are anxiety, depression, and trauma recovery.
Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
Karen, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Clint.
So for our listeners and watchers, I always like to start with a good definition because we need something to kind of wrap our head around. We've talked about trauma on this podcast a whole bunch. It's pretty much the fabric of everything that we do. We understand it as an underlying cause between many mental health and substance use or addiction related problems. But when we think about trauma bonding, what is that?
Yeah, so I will give you my definition. It's probably not the same as what you would see in the dictionary. So, for example, in the dictionary, or if you Google it, you're going to read about trauma bonding, and it's going to sound like very negative. It's going to have a negative connotation to it. And basically, the negative connotation is that there is a bond between the abuser and the abusee. And of course, that is seen as really unhealthy. So trauma bonding is an unhealthy attachment on someone who's causing you harm, is one of the definitions of it. I've also seen it used as when one person trauma dumps on another, right? And maybe someone that wasn't anticipating all that information because the person who's been abused might be so desperate to be heard or have someone understand what they've went through. So those are a couple of different ways that I've seen it used.
And so you're saying, hey, I actually don't think this is a negative thing, or do you feel like it is a negative thing in your experience when you've been working with clients? How do you see that play out?
Yeah, I think the way that the words are put together in society, it's definitely negative. I'm always like a little skeptical about terminology. Like, I think two people can talk about their trauma history in a safe, healthy way and have a connection, right? But it's the intention behind it. So one of the ways, if you're wondering how to have a healthy connection with someone and not just dump their traumas on them, is you ask, like, is it okay if I share my story with you? And if they say yes, it's like, well, is there any part that you don't want me to share? Because you have to be careful about not traumatizing the other person, right? So that's, like, I have a group for survivors, and I feel like we work on healthy shares of our trauma stories.
Tell me more about healthy sharing, because I feel like this is a common theme. So as we become more comfortable in understanding of mental health and the terminology connected with it, then we understand trauma more. And so then we talk about our trauma more because it's something we're starting to unpack or discover or process. How do you, one, ask somebody, hey, I tell you about something in my life, and the other person doesn't know exactly what your story is. So how can they even say yes or no? Because they don't know what's about to come. And when you are sharing, what's the difference between sharing and like connecting with somebody around, a traumatic experience versus, as you mentioned, like a trauma dump where you're just kind of, laying everything out there for someone?
Yeah, really great questions. I think working with a therapist is a good way to start, and sharing your story and then asking your therapist on guidance on how to share that with other people. Most of the time, honestly, my survivors I work with undershare. They don't have a burning desire to share this painful things with other people. But there are people that I work with that are hurting so much and don't have anybody paying them attention in their life, that they get desperate on sharing just anything. And they show up sometimes in my community too. And so I ask them to pause. I ask them to think about giving warnings, like a trauma warning. And then I tell them there's ways to be general and there's ways to be specific. So if you, for example, if someone tried to kill you and a knife was involved, you say that, like, there was an attempt on my life, there was a knife involved. May I share, or is that triggering to somebody else? Right. And if nobody else in the room has had an episode of possibly being stabbed, maybe the group is comfortable to hear that. So that's kind of an example. Just asking permission before you really get into the specifics of something that's really traumatizing.
Okay, so pause, give a warning, and then also just be mindful of who you're talking to, letting them know, because as you mentioned, you don't want to re-traumatize somebody. But I want to kind of back up. So there's a common pattern that we see with a lot of people who have come through some sort of trauma. And one of them has to do with patterns of abuse, right? So when we think about somebody who's in an abusive family where a parent is abusive to them, later on in life, there's some research that shows that there's a percentage of those folks who may choose to be or find themselves with a partner who is also abusive, who shares similar characteristics of that. First, can you kind of unpack, why does somebody who experienced a negative trauma when they're a kid play that out again in other relationships, even if they're not romantic relationships, whether it's friendships or boss relationships? How does that happen? And why does that happen?
It's a bit complicated. And so we call, when a survivor's had the childhood abuse scenario and then goes on and is abused in other scenarios, we call that complex trauma. And when the new diagnostic manual comes out for therapists and doctors, there's going to be the diagnosis complex post-traumatic stress. There's already lots of articles and research about it. And so there's a few theories on why that happens. One of the theories is when a child is abused and has that messaging, it's cellular. An example of a core belief that they will get is, I'm not worthy or I'm worthless. So how they get to that belief is, when we're children, we are very concrete thinkers. And one of the thoughts that's common is, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And so if someone's hurting me, that must mean I'm bad. Now, as an adult, we know there's not truth to that. Good things happen to bad people all the time, and bad things happen to good people all the time. But even though we know that on a cognitive level, our subconscious, our programming is still there. And so we find ourselves being attracted to people that are familiar to us. We recognize them. And we recognize them because of those remembered experiences. And it's not that we like it. We don't necessarily like to continue to be abused. It's more like it's just what we know. It's very familiar. It's almost comfortable. It's almost like if someone treats us kindly, that feels foreign and unfamiliar and almost more scary, because when is that other shoe going to drop? When are they going to turn? So it's almost easier to be with someone unhealthy and toxic because that's just very familiar.
Yes, this is a great way to explain it. You think about in education. So I'm an educator, and one of the things they teach you in educator school or pedagogy is the stages of development. And as you mentioned, when you were a kid, in order to understand the world, we have to see things in black and white. We have to see things as this or that. And it's only as we get into our teenage years, but usually also connected with puberty, that we start allowing ourselves to see things as gray, right? Somebody does something to you that is bad as a kid, you say, this is a bad person. This person did a bad thing, right? And then somebody does something good to you and you say, this is a good person. And it could be the same person, a different day, but it's the way that we process information, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to grasp a basic pattern recognition and concepts. It's important as part of our learning and our brain development to be able to feel confident in facts and to be able to feel like we understand something so that we feel comfortable and safe to learn new things. But if you carry that out into the relationships, the formative relationships, especially with caretakers or caregivers or parents or family members or neighbors or people who are significant figures in your life when they have power, then it makes sense that we have to also take an assessment of ourselves and to say, okay, if bad things keep happening to me, that means I am bad. And so we structure and we form an identity around ourselves based upon how someone is treating us. The other thing that you mentioned that was really interesting was part of relationships, all relationships, whether they're healthy or not, is feeling seen and understood. We want to know that our partner sees and understands us. Now, this really depends on how we see and understand ourselves. If I see and understand myself as somebody who deserves abuse, who's not good enough, who should be treated this way because of who they are deep down, then I am attracted to, or I find myself connected with somebody who also sees me in that way because it helps me feel seen, helps me feel understood. This person actually gets me. Whereas if we grow up and we have a sense of innate value and worth, and we're able to have this courage, and we're able to see ourselves in a positive light, then when somebody treats us that way, it is contrasting with what we understand to be true based upon how we grew up and the identity that we formed as a kid. I don't think I'd ever really connected those two things together until you said that whole formation of black and white thinking. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about this thing that you talked about when it comes to like the familiar chaos and the predictability of it versus something that is not what we're used to. So if chaos is what you grew up in, then when you find yourselves, and we see this with people with borderline personality disorder, they have stable relationships, they have formative friendships, and then there's an element of self-sabotaging that happens somewhere along the line. How does this play out when it comes to chaos or predictability or control? Like, what's that relationship like? Why do we choose something that is chaotic, even if it's because it's familiar to us, I guess?
Yeah, it keeps happening because it's subconscious. Like it's not the forefront of our brain. Because if we sit down and think about, oh, A plus B is C, if someone hits me, we don't think, oh, they're going to hit again, or am I here because I was abused in the past? No. What we tend to think is, oh, they also had a hard childhood, or they've also been through a lot. And, we have this compassion, and this is how the bonding starts. We have compassion for this other person. Like we see the value in them, and we put their perceived value above our own, is what I see happening quite a bit with unhealthy, intimate relationships. And so what I will often ask survivors is, well, what about your value? Right? Like, how can you have all this compassion for this other person and not for yourself? Let's talk about this disconnection. And I also talk about, I love that you see the value in them despite what they're doing. I love that you can see their humanity and that you have grace, but that doesn't mean you deserve to put up with their behavior. And how can we set limits and boundaries so that you can get what you need? And is it possible that you can love someone and say goodbye to them because you're going to love yourself too?
Yeah, both things can be true at the same time, can't they? You can love someone and you can set boundaries that allow you to be in line with your core values. Something I'm learning from talking to smart folks like you is that we cannot set boundaries and we cannot have healthy relationships if we first don't understand what's important to us. And it seems like a common theme within trauma bond relationships is that somebody is not coming into a relationship, or even if they're just in a relationship, they're not exactly sure what is important to them, but they do know what is important to the other person. Have you seen that as like a thing in the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, I work with a lot of our military. And so it's common, like the active duty member will be very clear on their priority with work. And sometimes the spouse, and it can be male or female, kind of gets lost in that shuffle. Well, this is their career. And so, which is great. It's fine to support your partner in their career, but you also have to have your own goals and needs and wants and your own time to work on that. That also has to be a value.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. Can you tell me more about, I think relationships when it comes to family dynamics and romantic relationships, those things for trauma bonding seem pretty straightforward, but can you say more about colleagues or maybe workplace relationships or friendships and how you see that play out in the world when we're thinking about how this trauma bond happens?
Well, I think I can maybe just talk from personal experience, which is also professional experience. I am a complex trauma survivor myself. And so I had this boss who happened to be a high-ranking Navy captain who would say all these inappropriate things. And not only was he high-ranking, but he was like second in command of where I was working at the time and outranked the person that was first in command, honestly. When he would say things, it was a bit of a disconnect in my head. Like, what, first it was like, well, he's just old and inappropriate. Let it go, let it go. And so what can happen in a work situation where you're there and you're just trying to focus on doing your work and doing a good job and you're worried about your ratings and performance. It actually took another social worker saying to me, Karen, I think he's grooming you. And it was very shocking because grooming means building a relationship so you can even exploit the person even more. And so it really made me stop and think. And so then I became more aware of how he was talking to me. And then I started to document. Then I started to share with him, like, you're not being appropriate. You need to stop. He would not stop. Then it was, talking to the person above him. It got to the point where it got to be congressional, before that it got intervened. So it was a big thing for me about authority and abuse of authority and how perhaps I tolerated it longer than somebody who never had abuse in their history would have. It was just like, because it was just so familiar. I was like, okay, he's just inappropriate, or I would make excuses for him, at the beginning. So I hope that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you as a kid experienced somebody who was in a position of power, they had a higher position of power than you, and they abused that position of power, and this developed, this is some of that complex or developmental trauma that you're talking about that you had as a kid, your threshold, your ability to be able to detect and your ability to be able to take this kind of treatment is different than somebody that's not their experience at all.
Right.
That's not
Exactly.
normal. To somebody who didn't have that experience as a kid, this is going to seem really different. It's like, hold up, what? I'll never forget, like when I think about, it's really interesting. Like when I think about, I worked at a big technology company, and I had never in my professional workplace life had a grown man yell at me at work. And the moment that this was the founder, it was the CEO of the company, there was something that was not done to his expectations. And I remember he yelled at me, and I was a complete stopping point for me. I was like, hold on, I'm a grown ass man. I don't tolerate anybody to yell at me. That's not something that is normal in my life. I don't yell at other people. I don't have people yell at me. That's not the way I work. That's not the way I do things. And he was shook because there's a tendency with people who are in my position to operate one within that kind of tech culture, right? That is very fast paced. You see this often with kitchen staff, right? And chefs in restaurants where it's this kind of culture, right? Where it's like a normal everyday operating system. And if that's something you're used to, your threshold for being able to live and to be in that environment is pretty high, right? But if it's not something you're used to, it's going to seem very jarring, right? So those are an amazing example when you think about it in like the workplace environment. How do you see this happen when it comes to friendships? Have you seen anything different? Is there anything unique about it when it comes to friendships?
It's an interesting question. There are clients who will come to session and talk about something that happened with a friend, and I'll ask them about their personal definition of what it means to be a friend. Because I'm like, hold up, would you talk to somebody like this? And I explain to them that when anyone is bullying you, taking advantage of your kindness, or belittles you or talks you down, those qualities are not what make a friend. I do believe that survivors are more vulnerable into being in those situations with bullies. And you can be a bully at any age. You don't have to be in middle school to have bullies in your life. And then I asked them, like, okay, so how long do you plan on putting up with this bully? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, as long as you put up with the bully in your life, you are not in a stage or ready to be healed for healing, because you can't heal something that's ongoing.
Tell me more. Why is that the case?
Well, I'll give another example that maybe makes even more sense. Let's turn it around so we're not doing stereotypes so much. Let's say a husband comes to therapy and says, my wife is cheating on me and I want to forgive her. And I'll say, well, is she still cheating? And if he says yes, I'm like, you can't forgive a behavior that's ongoing. And so when someone is actively hurting us, emotionally, physically, sexually, we can't heal because it's still ongoing. Healing starts when you are able to say, no, I deserve better than this. You will not treat me like this anymore. And then you can heal with that person in your life or without them. And a lot of times I'm going to bet it's going to have to be without them.
So for our listeners, watchers who are like, yo, how do I even do this thing? This setting these boundaries thing, you can see our episode on boundaries. We walk through the entire process. There's like a 4-step process of setting boundaries, creating your boundaries, understanding what is a healthy boundary, knowing that boundaries change, all of that stuff. But it's an essential part. If you don't have any kind of boundaries, that also means that you haven't communicated your needs. That also means that you don't know what you need or what's important to you. And so a key part of understanding trauma bond relationships is, one, understanding what you need, what's important to you, what are your core values. 2, juxtaposing those in light of the relationships that you're in, whether that's a romantic relationship, friendships, or work relationships. And then 3, if there is some sort of mismatch, if you have values and your relationship with another person is conflicting with these core beliefs that are important to you, and you communicate to this person that it's important, and they are not honoring that boundary, then we potentially have what's called an abusive relationship. And it might be, if it's related to some sort of trauma that you've had developmentally or in the past, it might be a trauma bond. Okay, I want to get super practical. Can we get super practical for a second, Karen?
Sure, that's what I like to do.
There are 7 stages that are popularly associated with trauma bonding, and all of these are things that are typical in a trauma bonding relationship. I'm going to give you each one. I'm hoping you can unpack, maybe give us an example of this, okay? So one of the first stages is what we call love bombing, and this is where you get excessive flattery or praise from a partner or someone. Can you give us an example or how you see love bombing play out?
I actually love talking about love bombing because now that I've been a therapist, it's now 25 years and a survivor, and I've dated around the world too. I kissed a lot of frogs before I married my husband. And so love bombing, I get very suspicious when I see a person that's very charismatic and over the top. I get really suspicious. So an example of this is if you're dating someone and they put you first 1,000% of the time to their own detriment, because that doesn't last. That can't last. And so you have to ask yourself, are they doing this because they don't have boundaries? Or is it because of their trauma? Or are they doing this because they are hoping to groom me, reel me in, and later they're going to change their ways? So examples of it are things like excessive gift giving, over the top affection. It's the person that just runs and jumps and does anything for you at any point. Before you even know you have a need, they're filling it. You got to ask yourself, like, okay, like, what's going on here? So that's love bombing. It's like on a first date, someone's like, I already know I'm in love with you. I've been waiting for you all my life. Like, oh my God, let's move in together.
Yeah, I think another key thing when it comes to love bombing, and it will not show up at the beginning, but it will show up somewhere within this trauma bond relationship, is that though this person will swear up and down that they are keeping no record of things that they are doing, they are meticulously keeping record of things that they are doing. They will bring these things up. If this person says, well, I did this for you, I did this for you, I did this for you, what they're doing is they're creating a leverage point. This is something that makes you feel obligated. In psychology, we call this the reciprocity effect, right? So if I give you something, or if I do a small favor for you, even if it's really not that significant, I then feel the need to bring reciprocity or to do something back for you, right? We see this within sales techniques of people, and they're like, hey, I just want to start this relationship off right. I want to give you $100 gift card just to value you for your time and to say, thank you for taking the time for this sales call. The person, even though they're listening to a pitch from another company, now feels obligated to partner with this person because they've done something nice for them, right? Even if it's not in proportion of the second ask. So love bombing, look for it. It's there. Number 2, trust and dependency. So this person does anything to gain a partner's trust. And the key word here is dependence. Tell me how you've seen this play out.
I've seen this played out is sort of like the savior complex or the Superman complex. There's someone that will come in and save the day. And then you believe you can depend on that person to always save you. An example would be, and I've seen this in the military too, and I'm not picking on the military. A lot of my clients, even today, are in the military or retirees. But the example I see quite frequently is the person that's the service member rescuing somebody that's in an abusive home. And so they marry them and then they take them away. And then that person gets really dependent on that service member. And sometimes that can work out. It can be a healthy relationship, but sometimes it's really unhealthy. That's where I've seen it the most is in a healthy relationship, you have to be able to trust and depend on someone, but they also have to trust and depend on you. there does have to be some sort of give and take for it, and not like the scorecard like we were talking earlier, but just a healthy flow where you both feel like your needs are getting met and you can trust each other and equally depend. It shouldn't just be one-sided. That's a really unhealthy dynamic.
Yeah, I've also seen in terms of dependency, this need to isolate the person. So if you go to your mom sometimes when you're having a hard time and this person is saying, or this friend or this partner is saying, hey, why do you go to your mom? This should be a problem that we solve just between the two of us, right? Like, or why do you tell your friends about this? We need to keep this between us. Or you hang out with your friends way too much. Aren't I the most important person in your life? And now we start to see how this blends with things like narcissism and stuff. But at the end of the day, one of the goals is to create that kind of trauma bond is to isolate, right? And so this person is kind of disconnecting you with other people and making you solely rely on them. All right, now let's get into where the trauma bond starts to show its teeth so far. So the third one is criticism. This means that this person is blaming or criticizing the partner to make them feel bad about themselves. Why is this like an essential part of a trauma bond?
Well, the one I hear pretty frequently is, you see how stupid you are? You're so lucky I married you because nobody else would, because you are just that dumb. Like, you are so lucky to have me. And if you've been through a lot of abuse, it could be easy for you to believe that. That's the example that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, if you have a trauma bond, this person doesn't want you to feel like they have other options. That makes sense. And number 4, maybe millennials' favorite word is gaslighting. So gaslighting, so manipulating the partner into thinking that I'm the crazy one. So, maybe you could tell us how do you see gaslighting show up in a trauma bond?
The example that comes to mind the most is one partner drops off his spouse at the door of the hospital. She's in labor. Makes up a reason for not being there. Well, of course I couldn't be there with you. You were yelling at me before. You didn't do this and you didn't do that. So of course I couldn't be there. You did this. And so it makes the person who's having the baby think like, oh my gosh, did I do something wrong? Is this my fault that they're not here for me? And so giving birth is a crazy example, but that's like a recent story I heard is a partner dropping the person off at the door and saying, yeah, I can't do this with you because you were yelling at me, or you did X, you didn't make dinner right, or this was going wrong. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
And so as a therapist, a lot of times it's like, I ask them to turn the tables. Like, imagine your partner had a bad kidney stone attack and he had been yelling at you, or there was an argument. Would you just drop them off at the door? Like, is that something you would do? And it makes them think.
Yeah.
Like, if the situation was turned, like, how would you act? And I explain how a gaslighting is the other person is basically telling you that your thoughts and feelings are not valid, that you're crazy. It's not crazy to want your partner to be with you in the delivery room, right? Or at the hospital if you're in need.
Totally. Okay, the next one, number 5, is addiction. This is where the partner gets emotionally addicted to the positive reinforcement that comes after abuse. Okay, so there's an abuse, and then after the abuse comes like some positive reinforcement, and then we get addicted to that. Can you tell me how you've seen this play out in trauma bonds or in relationships?
It's a very common pattern in domestic violence, that wheel of power and control. So what it looks like is really romantic, sweet behavior. It's the flowers and the chocolates and, baby, I am so sorry. You're my one and only. I'm sorry I did this. Let's make up. So it's very exciting because it's almost like the first date all over again, right? Where this person's lavishing you with love and attention and concern. And you feel like, oh, they're really trying, to be there for me. And so it gets to be pretty confusing.
Okay, number 6 is a loss of self. This is where the partner loses all sense of who they are. What does this mean when you see this in a trauma bond?
The best way I can describe this stage is it really feels like the person has just given up. It's almost like Eeyore, like, woe is me. This is my lot in life. I'm trapped in this. I have no options, is what I see it presented as. So that's when the therapist, or, if it's a good friend that you see this happening to, so that's when you do the cheerleading, reminding them, like, no, there is more to life. You deserve to be in a relationship that makes you happy, and not just happy one day every 6 months. Cheerleading is what I think is really needed, and reminding the person, don't give up. There's more to life.
Yeah. And this is kind of connected with the last one, number 7, which is resignation and submission, where a partner gives in to avoid conflict and to please their abuser. I want to push back on another common stereotype that you hear, especially among men, and that's like the happy wife, happy life type of mentality, where it's saying, your needs actually aren't important. As long as this person's not angry, then you're happy. And that's actually kind of a toxic way to view things if you think about it, because both people have needs, both people want to be happy, and you cannot meet one person's everything. You can't be everything to one person. We are meant to be in a community, and there's many different roles in the community, and there's many different values of friendships, and then work colleagues, and all of these different relationships matter. And so when you reside in yourself to, like, if you're in a relationship or you're in a partnership and you say, I know this is not right, this doesn't feel good to me, and I would rather just give in than actually talk about it, that's a key sign that this is probably a problem. Do you have any examples of that, or another example maybe?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, because the cliche happy wife, happy life, it's taking it just too far. And anything in the extremes ends of, polarities just don't work. If a man says that because he's choosing to let an argument go, because nobody wins if you're falling on your sword for every argument. So if you let something go, no big deal. That can be healthy. But if you're doing that every single time and ignoring your own needs, that's very toxic, like you're mentioning. So I do have a man that I'm working with whose spouse is very belittling and sarcastic and is mean to him by making jokes. And so we have been working on that. He's not ready to leave. So what we're working on is that boundary setting that's so important. And just him recognizing, okay, where are ways where he can push back, that it's actually healthy and shows his power. Because one of the things he beats himself up about is, I was a machine in the military. Like, he's retiree old guy now. I was a machine, and I would, take out the enemy, and I let this little woman just boss me around and tear me down. He goes, I don't recognize myself. I go, yeah. And you, in your relationship, you want to feel like you're being your best self and not your worst self. And so how do we get where you feel like you're a proud warrior in your relationship? Because that's the you that you recognize and respect, because you're not respecting yourself right now. So I think a lot of it actually just comes down to self-respect. How can you get there back?
Yeah, so there's your 7 stages of a trauma bond. We've got love bombing, trust and dependency, criticism, gaslighting, addiction, loss of self, and resignation and submission. Before we talk about where people can learn more about you, anything else you want people to really know when it comes to trauma bonding that maybe they misunderstand or that they don't get?
I think what's really important, it's going to be really hard to recognize if someone truly loves, values, and respects you if you're not able to do that for yourself. So if you can't honestly look in the mirror and say, I really care about this person, yourself, I value them, I respect you, you're saying this to yourself, then that's time to get help. And I actually tell people coming out of toxic relationships, work on yourself before you dive into another one. Heal those pieces of you that you are not respecting. How can you be the best version of yourself before you go into another relationship? It'll definitely help you recognize on what's healthy and not healthy.
So you obviously have a ton of experience working with folks through these really challenging relationships and understanding trauma. Where can people go to connect with you, to learn more about you and all the awesome work that you're doing?
So I have many things that I offer, and I work with men and women one-on-one. I say women and a few good men, and most of my men are also trauma survivors too. But I prefer working with people that are really ready to heal. Like they really want this in their life. They truly want their life to be better. And so I offer VIP days. I offer one-on-one therapy or coaching. And for women, I have a membership of survivors. This is women usually over 40, 50 years old who are complex trauma survivors. They were abused in their childhoods and have gone on to be abused in other relationships. My membership, how you find it, is healingfromtraumatogether.com. And my website is healthrivedream.com, and I'm on the usual social media platforms as well.
Cool. And one of the coolest things, and you kind of mentioned this when it came to being really honest with yourself about your situation in a relationship, in a traumatic relationship, in a trauma bond. Sometimes that is so hard to do by yourself. Your voice is so familiar, your voice is your own, and it's really hard to separate what is true versus maybe some of the lies or things that you've been telling yourself or that other people who are toxic have been telling you. And having a community like you're talking about with other people who have gone through something similar, one, makes you not feel alone, and two, allows you to really see things from a different perspective. We oftentimes give the best advice to our friends, right? We're able to see things so clearly and objectively because it's from a different point of view, right? And it seems so obvious to us. But then when it comes to ourselves, we often really struggle because we're not objective and we have all this context and nuance and layers of trauma and stuff that get in the way of us being able to see things clearly. So working with a therapist, being in a community, all of that stuff helps you to unpack, to process, to understand your trauma, and to be able to grow and to live a happier, healthier life from that. Karen, thank you so much for joining us on the show and for telling us and sharing a little bit of your expertise today. We are going to link to all of the stuff that she mentioned in the show notes and in the description box of this video and podcast, wherever you're getting this or watching this. And remember, y'all, trauma bonding, it is real. And it is also more common than you think. And with the help of truth, of a trusted professional, and a supportive group, it's also treatable. We'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.